Welcome to another edition of the Shadowcast. And today we have our special guest, Dylan Knight, who's going to tell us all about the folklore of the East Midlands. Hello, Dylan.
Hello, good afternoon.
Good afternoon. And with me today, as ever, we have Chris Ball.
Hello.
And Dave Bray.
Hello.
So, Dylan, I think we'll kick off with the question, what exactly is folklore, and does it necessarily have to relate to the past?
Folklore is a mixture of things because in more recent times, over the past few years, it's become very much a buzzword and almost had a bit of a resurrection in interest, especially online and even in social media as well. So there are plenty of Instagram posts all about folklore, and there is a whole plethora of podcasts, one of which is my own. But folklore really is a mixture of local customs from either yesteryear or even evolving today. Because it's something that is ever evolving. It's very easy to just assume that when we're talking about folklore, we're talking about something that's from hundreds, if not almost 1,000 years ago. But folklore is something that keeps going even now. So, for example, we've heard, or perhaps all grown up with the idea of Bloody Mary.
Yes, indeed.
Right. So that in itself is an example of modern day folklore. Some people tend to use the term urban myths, but realistically, urban myths do become folklore in their own right. So it's all kind of related. So it's a mixture of local customs. So whether that's putting a candle on for every full moon or something like that in our own personal practice, just that little habit of ritual even, or it could be something like celebrating the harvest or celebrating bringing in the May with your local community. So actions like that. It's also local dialect, local buzzwords, local phrases, and also local beliefs of the people, whether that's from today or whether that's from 100 years ago, maybe even more. But all of it is a massive mosaic of the culture of the people that ended up either following those traditions or creating their own. So it's a very, very nuanced question. Was the second question, does it have to be related to the past? Was that right?
Yes, that's right. I think there is the idea that it has to be ancient, but I think you will disagree with that.
Very much so. I mean, it's always good to look at something that's from the past and see how that even compares to something that we do today. So, for example, if there's a tradition that's been going on for like 900 years, fantastic. Somehow that's stood the test of time. I think there is there's a tradition in Essex, I think it is, where if you bake, there's this bread that's been baked, and there's also money given out to the poor, which is going on for like almost 800 years or so, and goes on to the present day. But it doesn't always have to come from the past. Some of them can actually be quite recent, and some of them can actually be more of a sort of modern take on something old. For example, I suppose you could even argue that a lot of modern paganism as a whole is coming from that particular strand. So it resurrects old ceremonies and old traditions, or at least what it believes to be old ceremonies and old traditions, and then they do this habitually every year, and then it becomes something of its own right. That in terms, I suppose you could argue, as well as being a religious practice, is also a modern take on a folkloric theme. But the interesting thing is that with some stories and with some tales, some of them are stuck in the past. They are on about those particular subjects and things. So, for example, there is the tale of Richard III when he's preparing to go to war against Henry Tudor, getting ready for getting his troops prepared for going to the Bosworth area for his encounter with Henry Tudor. And the folklore story there is that he's visited by an old crone or a young witch, depending on which version of the story you're talking about here. And this woman comes with him with a warning to say that the silver boar will become blue, and that his head will knock upon the last stone of the bridge, or something along those lines. And Richard III's like, all right, yeah, cheers, thanks for that. Get her out of here. I don't know what she's talking about. Get her out. And then when he's going on his way to Bosworth, leaving the city of Leicester, he comes out and comes along a bridge where his spur hits upon a rock, and he suddenly thinks of the words that this woman told him. And then he goes into battle, and it doesn't end very well, because that's exactly how history plays out. And Henry Tudor, victorious, comes into Leicester carrying the body of Richard III, and his head supposedly knocks upon the very same stone of the bridge that his spur had hit on the way out, and then brings that back in to his body into Leicester. And that's very much of its time. Some stories and ballads are very much of their time, and in a way that's where they should remain. But everything is always open to interpretation, and if people want to resurrect that particular story or that particular ballad or song and then have that done with a modern setting, there's no reason why you can't. But you're going to have that thing where, okay, so how are you going to explain Richard III being in 21st century England? That's up to the creator, the writer, the director, whatever, to figure out. But all stories and ballads can actually have lessons and also have themes that can be carried on into the modern day. And that's the beauty of them, I think. It's that in a way we carry these stories on because they mean something to us, because they meant something to the people who told them before, and so on and so on. And the thing about folklore, whether it's a practice, whether it's a story, whether it's a ballad, whether it's a belief, they all change with the culture and the people of their time, of the times they come into. And so they mean something to all of us through the passage of time.
Fantastic. And certainly this country is so renowned for its many customs and traditions, isn't it? It's very rich.
Very much so. Very much so. I mean, there's in Derbyshire, they have the custom of well dressing, which potentially can be linked to pagan times, because the Celtic peoples of Britain and Ireland, for example, they were very much into their goddess being personified in the rivers, being personified in the waters of the land. And so the local chief of the local tribes, they would ritually marry the goddess of the particular land. And it's thought that the idea of these well-dressing ceremonies may have come from that, because the ancestors left votive offerings within the waters, within the rivers and the lakes as well. And this is something that we actually do today. So every time we've made a wish by tossing a coin into a water fountain, for example, a wishing well, that's kind of where that idea comes from. You're giving something to the divine in order to either gain a good harvest or good luck or fortune and love, that kind of thing. But historically and academically, it would be argued that the practice of well dressing comes from Christian belief. So this is where things start to blur. Which is the downside to folklore, I would say. But at the same time, it's kind of like the really interesting part, because it's like, well, what kind of separates Christianity from pagan belief and vice versa? But in Derbyshire, well dressing is very much a big thing, where people create garlands, they create all these wonderful banners that go around the wells themselves, and they just have a whole day of celebration going on, whether it's music, bands, food stalls, Morris dancers, a whole gamut of British practice comes into play at these events. And it's something that's still done today. And that's a wonderful thing, because it's carrying on from something that the people back in the past did, like the previous question. And it's something that carries on even now.
Speaking of Derbyshire, can you tell us all about your podcast?
Yeah, of course. My podcast is called The Tales from the Otherwood, and it's a podcast that explores and tells us stories from the East Midlands as a whole. It also talks about some of the folkloric themes that are associated with the stories. So the format is you'll have me telling a story from one of the counties in the East Midlands, and then it's what I call the chat bit afterwards, which is a description and basically and talk about that folkloric theme caught within that particular tale or that particular story. So more or less, it's an archive of the tales and folklore of the East Midlands themselves. And it came from back in lockdown, when I was actually just doing some storytelling, just for fun and also to try and keep people's morale up, I guess. And it wasn't called Tales from the Otherwood then, it was called something else. But it was just basically me, a camera, just telling a legend or a myth from anywhere that interested me, really. And what I was really kind of interested in, though, was that in the stories that I was telling, it was more of the little facts and also the themes from behind that story. And I found that when I was storytelling those particular tales, I was kind of getting mixed up with trying to tell an interesting fact about this thing or an interesting fact about that thing at the same time. So I was like, right, that's not going to work. So listening to some other podcasts, I decided, well, let's just try that format for myself and just give that a go. So I separated it. So you do the story, and then you look at the folkloric theme within that particular story. I mean, I'm based in Nottinghamshire, but I do cover all of these Midlands as a whole. I mean, I do have my own favourite places, i.e. Nottinghamshire, but that does shine through, unfortunately. But I do like to try and cover the other areas as much as possible. So Derbyshire is a very interesting mix, because almost every part of the East Midlands has its own kind of things going on, folk-wise, legend-wise, belief-wise. So, for example, in Nottingham, of course, we've got Robin Hood, but we've also got the Wise Men of Gotham, which are a whole bunch of, I suppose they're more of a collection of anecdotes rather than actual proper epic tales. They just tend to be of the variety of the Wise Men of Gotham did this silly thing, and here they did. For example, the Wise Men of Gotham, they were coming up to rent day, and it turned out that because they were so late, they decided the best thing to do would be to attach all of their rent money into a purse, which they would tie onto a hare, because a hare can run really, really fast. So one man of Gotham says, you need to go to Bilborough, and then he passes it on to his mate, and his mate says, you need to go to Leicester. And then he passes it on to his mate and says, you need to go to Newark. And so they put all their rent money into the purse, onto the hare, and let it run off. And then one of the men shouts out, no, you're supposed to go to Bilborough first. And then his mate turns around and says, no, it's all right. He probably knows a quicker route. And they're all kind of stories of this kind of, are you insane? Are you kind of nuts for doing this thing? But the folklore behind the Men of Gotham is that they were only made out to be a little bit weird and a little bit strange, because the folklore there is that supposedly King John was meant to be coming from down south all the way up into Nottingham, and to do so, he'd have to go into the road through Gotham village into Nottingham. And the people of Gotham didn't like this at all, because that meant that their road would then become a king's road, which means they would have to pay more taxes, they would have to pay more levies, and they would have to maintain it just for the king, and they wouldn't be able to use it themselves. So the legend is that the people of Gotham decided, well, the king's sending his envoys here to make sure it's safe, so how about we just make it look like we're all totally insane? So when these envoys arrive, they see the people of Gotham wheeling cheeses down a hill and telling them to go to Nottingham Market by themselves. They also see a few more people of Gotham trying to drown a fish as its punishment for eating all the other fish in water. And then there's another bunch of people of Gotham trying to build this structure around this orchard tree. And it's like, what are you doing? Well, we're trying to capture the cuckoo. Why? What's the cuckoo done? Oh, nothing. It's just that when the cuckoo brings summer, we may as well capture it. So then it means that summer's here all year round. So these envoys then end up taking the word back to King John, who thinks, because back in medieval times, they believed that insanity was contagious. They thought, yeah, let's just go round Gotham and we'll just head straight into Nottingham using the old road instead. And that is a little bit of folklore just from that particular area. And that supposedly explains these slight stories of insanity in Nottinghamshire. There's also the tale of Jack and the Buttermilk, about a young boy who ends up getting captured by a witch. And yes, of course, there's Robin Hood, but I imagine we might be talking about that later. Whereas in Lincolnshire, you've got almost everything. You've got shape-shifting witches, shape-shifting wizards, werewolves, strange fairy creatures that will curse you, a whole bunch of stuff like that. Going into Rutland, you've got con artists trying to get away with free beer. And then in Leicestershire, you've got Richard III. You've also got Black Annis, who is said to be this hag who has one eye and razor-sharp claws and eats the flesh of young children. And she's supposed to haunt the area of the Dane Hills. But you've also got Ethelreda, who was a Saxon princess who ended up defending Leicestershire against the Viking hordes that were invading. And then down in Northampton, again, you've got people that tend to be more like con artists, whether it's a man tricking a boggart into leaving his land, or whether it's another man who's actually trying to convince the local lord that there's a hole in his grounds that goes all the way down to Australia. And then you come up to Derbyshire, where not only have you got a lovely mixture of fairy belief and witchcraft, it's something that's kind of rare, because I believe it was Ronald Hutton who pointed out that areas, when it comes to beliefs of witches and fairies, they tend to be separate. So where one area believes in fairies, another believes in witches, they don't necessarily go at the same time, but in Derbyshire they do. There's a whole mixture of ghost stories across all these Midlands, but Derbyshire seems to have a nice mixture of fairies and also a nice mixture of witches as well, such as the Bakewell witches, where a Scotsman was found in the castles in London, where he was actually in the king's cellar, I believe. And he was asked, how did he get into the king's cellar? And why was he there? And he drunkenly told about how he was staying at with some women in Bakewell, and they put him up for the night. and he had this weird glow coming from the floorboards. So he ended up going into looking into the floorboards and watched them all do some kind of incantation where they ended up going to London. So he thought, I'll try it out for myself and see if it works. He says the incantation, and then he ends up in the King's beer cellar in London, where he happily helps himself. So this actually took place as in real life. I don't know if he actually did appear in with a magic word, but this was actually based upon a real witch hunting case back in the day, where the Scotsman was indeed found in the King's cellar. That's the reason he gave. So this actually made the king very, very worried, because it was James II, who I believe was very, very into his witches at the time. So he decided to send out some witch finders who found the witches in Bakewell, and they did have the Scotsman's clothes in his house. Their story is that apparently he was that drunk, he started wrecking the room that he was lodging from them, and so they told him to just get the hell out, and they hadn't seen him for weeks, and he must have just ended up in London or something like that. So that's where you start getting that weird mixture of where folkloric belief about witches and such is actually based upon true events, and you actually get quite a lot of that in folklore as a rule. Not all the time, and if anything, I would even argue that some folkloric beliefs are based on poems. So there is a poem about the Holbeach gamesters in Lincolnshire, where there were four men who were playing a card game of whist, and then one of their friends died. So they had his funeral, and on the day of the day before his funeral, his body was set out in the church and everything, and his three other friends were that emotionally compromised that they decided to have one last game of whist and get really, really drunk in the Chequers Arms across the road from the All Hallows Church. They got that drunk, they decided it would be a great idea to go into the church, break it open, and then play with his mate's body for one last card game. So what happens here, this story goes that supposedly a walking local saw there were lights coming from the church and thought that there must be someone robbing it. So he alerted the sexton and a few other locals, and they get a ladder, climb up onto the top of the ladder, and look through the church windows and find these men all drinking there, playing cards, having a wonderful good time. But then there's some kind of strange rumble and a split, and then these dark spirits come out of the church flagstones of the ground and grab the three drunken men and then carry them down to hell or wherever you insert spiritual place here, and then seals it back up again. And supposedly to this day, the All Hallows Church porch is haunted by these three men. And supposedly, if anybody walks across them at night, so you just be careful, Lee, going around graveyards at night, mate, then you'll see that there are these three spirits who invite you for a drink, invite you for a game of cards, but if you play with them, you will end up getting sucked into their world and sucked into their reality, so you'll become one of their ghosts that join them for eternity. Again, this actually happened in real life, except without the ghost part. So there were four men who were very renowned for drinking at the Chequers Arms, and also renowned for playing games and gambling and being general nuisance. One of them did die, and three of them did end up playing games and getting very, very drunk and breaking into the church to play a game of cards with their body. But what actually happened, because there are documents for this, is that the locals caught on to what was going on and thought, oh, we better get them out. And then they stormed the church, burst it open, and then found the three men and put them in jail for the night. The three men were, once they sobered up, they were extremely apologetic, couldn't really believe what they'd done, and even paid for all the damages that they'd created. So they ended up paying for the church door, which they ruined, and also any reparations to the church in general. But strangely enough, one of them, who was a Dr. Watson, he actually died on a road of a heart attack about 20 years later, and supposedly on that road from Holbeach in Lincolnshire going across to other villages, it's supposed to be haunted. But where I think the ghost story part of that tale came from was two different poems written about that encounter. One of them writes about how the three men were dragged to hell by spectres coming from the church, a bit like I described earlier. Another was written about 40 years later after that poem, and it kind of follows the same format, but with this one, it has that the gamesters were playing the games. They heard the door being knocked and realized that it must be the authorities come to arrest them. And then one of them turns round, slips on the chairs to the on the stairs to the altar, and ends up breaking his neck on the ground. Yeah. So it's a wonderful, weird thing where you've got this event which happened, basically three drunkards breaking into a church. God knows what they were thinking about playing with the guy's corpse, and getting caught, done for it. But it inspired two different poems that both added their own supernatural elements, because that in that last story, supposedly the body then turns round, opens its eyes, and tells them all they're being condemned to hell. Well, the last two gamesters, anyway. But it's a wonderful example how something really happened. Two poems were inspired by it, which then fuel this whole myth and legend about how All Hallows Church is haunted by these ghosts who had done this thing and were dragged to hell. So it's this weird, wonderful thing where you've got a historic event summed up and spread around by word of mouth as a fictionalized event, and now the belief is that it's this ghost haunting that is there. Obviously, something like that back in the 1740s, which is when the event took place, would have been talked around, especially in Holbeach, and apparently it was. And apparently the three men who actually did this had the stigma of everyone always knowing what they did, and supposedly this is what led the doctor to end up killing himself on that road, which he supposedly died by committing suicide. So whether that the guilt got to him or not, because I suppose back in those days when you've got everything is about word of mouth, and it's not like you can just go, Chris, Dave, what have you two done, you silly boys? It wasn't that at all. I think they were kind of ostracized for what they did, and the doctor just couldn't live with it, is my personal take on that. But it's interesting how you get an actual event that becomes a ghost story all of its own. And I think in maybe a lot of ways, that's how folklore works, which is something happens, then word of mouth happens, then word of mouth happens generations later, until eventually you've got, have you heard about the ghost? Well, this is what happened. And so this other story ends up getting evolves and becomes more widely known than the actual event itself. At least that's my idea anyway. But there are plenty of examples of those kind of things going on. And I just think that's a wonderful mutation of events becoming folklore.
Yes, it's an absolutely brilliant example. Thank you very much for that, Dylan. Before we move on, I think this would be an opportunity to take some questions. So first of all, Chris, do you have any general questions for Dylan?
Yeah, I do. Do you know about the Robin Hood story?
Yeah.
Now, the Robin Hood story. Now, some people say it's real, some people say it's fake. What do you take on the Robin Hood story, Dylan?
It was all written back in 1953. Robin Hood is a very strange thing because no one can pin it down. If for every performance of Robin Hood and every story and every movie of Robin Hood, there are at least as many different theories as to who Robin Hood actually was. So there are many different authors who, there are two books I read very recently who both had exactly very differing versions of who they thought the actual Robin Hood was. Both claiming also that they weren't actually setting out to prove who Robin Hood really was, and actually the historic thing spoke for itself. And they're both different people. Robin Hood, the earliest stories of Robin Hood, the earliest mention of Robin Hood that we have, comes from a poem. So this is why I say poems fuel folklore. It comes from a ballad, really, a sung poem about a man called Sloth. It was called Piers Plowman, and it was written back in 1377. And he's questioned by the man's called Sloth. He's a monk, and he's questioned by another monk. How is it you don't know your Lord's Prayer? And he says, well, I don't know the Lord's Prayer, but I do know the tales of Robin Hood and Ranulph of Guildford. And that, like I said, that was back in 1177. But the earliest ballads recorded come from a collection of more ballads, starting with Robin Hood and the Monk, Robin Hood and the Potter, and then there's the Yest or the Jest of Robin Hood, which is a whole sequence of 4 different ballads, all as well. It's one big, massive, epic ballad itself, but it's split into 4 different sections, which are 4 different stories, but they all relate into each other. Whereas Robin Hood and the Monk, Robin Hood and the Potter, Robin Hood and Guy of Gisborne, and the Death of Robin Hood, only those last 2 are mentioned in the Yest of Robin Hood, but as independent stories, they don't really follow on from each other, except that we all know this man called Robin Hood and his friends, who at the time were, there's Robin himself, Little John, Much the Miller's son, Will Scathlock, no Friar Tuck, no Maid Marian. They don't come until later. But as for who Robin Hood was this based on real people? That depends on which author you're going to read on the subject, unfortunately. Being in Nottingham, I have a friend who has looked into the whole history of Robin Hood, and he's actually one of the Robin Hoods of Nottingham. So there were 3, as in these are people that walk around nowadays dressed in the gear. They do the photo ops for any social thing going on, or event or whatever. And there was, where is it? There was Tony, there was and Adam, and there was Kevin. And unfortunately, Kevin died. But I believe there's someone who's taken his place now, but I've not met him before. So there are people who dress up as Robin Hood now for events and for charities and things like that. But in terms of who was Robin Hood based on a real person, I don't know. I think Robin Hood is an amalgamation. I think there are acts of people who were alive around the time when Robin Hood was supposed to be.
Yeah.
And they all kind of fall into the bracket of, well, you can see where that was based on, that would have influenced the story of Robin Hood that way. This one would have influenced the story of Robin Hood this way. And in one of those is actually a common man who became one of King John's archers, and he actually ended up defending King John. which kind of goes against the legend that we all know of Robin Hood being against King John. But he did live in the woods as an outlaw because the French king who inserted himself during King John's reign, King Louis, I think, yeah, it was one of the Louis. And this archer basically did guerrilla tactics against the French armies, to the point where the French even retreated back into France, recollected their armies, and got fought back again. And as a reward, King John gave this particular archer, whose name eludes me right now, he actually rewarded him in this entire land of a woodland. But one of his bases of operation were the woods in Lincolnshire and in Nottinghamshire. So Sherwood Forest would have been one of those bases of operation. Eustace the monk, for example, he was a monk for a very limited amount of time because he was an absolute bugger. As in, he was a thief, he was a liar. He convinced all the other monks to give up their labor and just get drunk. He ended up leaving the monastery and becoming a pirate. And there are certain things that he did that may have more have inspired the tales of Friar Tuck, but it's thought that he was one of the influences of the Robin Hood story as well. So really, I would say, from my own point of view, that because Robin Hood is something to somebody else. And to me, he's an amalgamation. He's an amalgamation of different people who stuck it to the man back in the day. Because when you look at the history of when the Robin Hood stories are meant to be set, which is anywhere between the 12th century and even to the 14th century. So the earliest ballads that we know of, the Robin Hood and the Monk, for example, was printed at least in 1450, and that is kind of almost 200 years after when Robin Hood would have been alive, if he was a real person. But it's thought that the stories of Robin Hood themselves, in terms of the ballads and everything, came from other stories, and that the name Robin Hood was linked to give them all a bit of a common denominator. So you've got all these different outlaws doing different things that kind of all get put together as this Robin Hood character. And you find that Robin Hood was a term for different outlaws, more as a name that they took rather than it was a name they were given. So, for example, if someone got caught and put in prison for highway robbery, for example, and he was asked to give his name, he would say Robin Hood. But that I would say is something that people play on the legends more than that. It was a monarch passed on from generation to generation. But I would also say that what Robin Hood also was a symbol. Especially when it came to the folk themselves. So during the time of when Robin Hood was supposed to be alive, you've got Britain, or at least England, recovering from the Black Death. So the king put all the levies up, and this is where people were getting really, really angry because they were having to pay more taxes, and they were doing at least 4 times the workload because there wasn't the population to fulfill all the jobs. And basically they were, one man would be doing 4 other men's work and still getting paid for what? Yet the king's asking for more taxes. So that's something we can kind of identify with the king asking for more taxes. Wouldn't it be great if we had a story about someone who is sticking it to the king and actually taking the king's money and giving it to the people? So I think it came from a little bit of that. In fact, a lot of that. So this almost kind of anarchistic streak that runs through British comedy as a whole. Just this whole idea of, we know the king's in charge, we know that, but wouldn't it be great if someone pegged him, took some money from him or pegged him down a bit here and there, just in a way that our sense of humor as a culture and as a people, we're always ribbing somebody else, especially those who are meant to be on the higher positions than us, politicians nowadays, the royal family, where there's Spit and Image, there's the Royals TV show, all these things which create comedy upon our political and monarchy systems. And I don't think it's any different now than it is back then, except we've got GPS, so you can't hide in the woods anymore, really. But yeah, I would say you've got that element of almost anachronistic revolution, not revolutionary as in let's take the land, but revolutionary in that way of someone fighting against the established order and getting away with it. That's where it all comes from. But saying that, there is a belief that could Robin Hood have come from pagan times, and this is where I disagree. I'm a practicing pagan myself, and I think no, because the earliest form of Robin Hood we have, he is very much into worshipping the Virgin Mary. He's all about the Virgin Mary. At least he's all about the Virgin Mary until Marion comes along in the 1600s, when the Robin Hood story has transformed from this yeoman, this freeman, which it turns out means basically he's an independent man of his own work. So, for example, back in the day, a blacksmith would be considered a yeoman or a freeman, same as a potter, because they're both they're both working a craft which they can sell and also generate revenue, and also which generates taxes and so on and so on, instead of being a servant. Whereas Robin Hood in the 1600s, he becomes a different character. He's now this cast out nobleman, or this cast out bastard son of a nobleman who has heroically refused the lands and titles so he can rob from the rich and give to the poor. And this is where we get Maid Marian. This is where we get Friar Tuck. But I digress. What I was trying to go with was that Friar Tuck as a folk character. Robin Hood was actually used as a symbol for charity as well. So when it came to the May Day celebrations, especially in medieval times, you had lots of villagers all across England who would bring in the May, i.e. they would celebrate with bringing great boughs of different trees and different leaves and flowers and such, because we've come out of winter. The food stocks are a bit low. We've just had Easter and Lent and all that. Let's bring in the May, and let's have something we can celebrate. And what they would do is they would actually build these Robin Hood costumes and parade them around other villages in a bid to raise money for their local churches. So basically, you had this character Robin Hood going around on these floats, I suppose, not like these massive big floats with cars, but like on a cart horse, but with all these bows of May flowers, hawthorn and oak and so on, and raising money to keep their churches all together. And it was a name that was passed on a bit like a May King. So if someone was elected to be the Robin Hood for next year, then he would be given the name Robin Hood.
Yeah.
And so you've got this weird dichotomy of, you've got Robin Hood, the character that we all know, which is this outlaw, this thug who lives in the woodlands with his mates and basically robs the king's highway and takes the money. And then you've got these criminals who use the name of Robin Hood because they're playing on the knowledge of Robin Hood, the name, the ballads, the stories. And then you've also got this title of Robin Hood being passed on in a folk sense, in a way of, right, Dave, you get to be Robin Hood next year, so we're going to call you Robin Hood for the next 12 months. And then the year after that, Lee, it's your turn. Year after that, Chris, you're Robin Hood, and so on and so on. So this whole idea of Robin Hood coming from this whole idea of a backwoodsman who has a very generous, charitable heart is very much a Victorian invention, I'm sad to say, which is based upon these stories and ballads from the 1600s, where he was a lot more genteel, he was a lot more gentlemanly, and became this lovable rogue. And then in the 1800s, this needed diluting somewhat, so it became a lot more what we think Robin Hood was supposed to be, and he was a lot nicer, and he was basically just slap my thigh and call me Charlie, and let's go and rob some bad kingsmen and give this to the good people of the poor, woof, kind of character. But actually, in the original ballads of Robin Hood, he's a whiny little git. He, especially in Robin Hood and the Monk. I mean, it even starts with him moping at the fact he can't go and celebrate Mass at Whitsun, which is Passover. So he ends up being told by Little John, mate, if you go to Nottingham, to St. Mary's Church, and perform the Mass for Mary there, you're going to get caught, mate. Don't do it. So Robin Hood says, yeah, well, I'm going to do it anyway. So Little John tells him, right, okay, come on then, let's go to Nottingham. Let's make sure you get there all right. And to pass the time, they're playing a game of marks, which is where they choose an object and go, I bet you 10 marks that if you hit that, I'll give you 10 marks, but I'll give you 20 if you can hit that one over there instead. And they're playing this bow and arrow shooting game along the way. Little John is doing way better than Robin Hood. Robin hates it and starts fighting with him. Little John beats the living hell out of Robin Hood and tells him, right, you know what? If you want to go to Nottingham and get caught, that's your business. I'm going back to the Greenwood. I'm going back to the guys, and I'll just see you later. And then walks off. Robin Hood goes to St. Mary's Church, where, of course, he does perform Mass. He does celebrate Mass. And then he ends up getting caught by the sheriff, who finds word because there was a monk who told him everything. And this is a monk that Robin Hood had passed earlier on. Word gets back to Little John. Little John thinks, right, we can't leave him in the jail. He's going to get executed. Let's go and help him. So Little John and Much the Miller's son go to Much the Miller's son's uncle's house so they can watch the road, because they devise the best way to do it is to find that monk who snitched on Robin, and then let's take it from there. And they do. They find the monk coming along that road that they can see from Much the Miller's son's uncle's house. And he's also got his young companion with him. So they go down and they talk with the monk and his assistant. And the monk says, oh, yes, I've got some wonderful news. I gave it Robin Hood. I spotted Robin in Nottingham. I told the sheriff, and I a good lad. And Little John tricks them into coming off the horse and says, you've done a wonderful job there. Well done, mate. But I've got to tell you, he's my mate. And they end up beheading the monk. Much the Miller's son beheads the assistant for no reason at all, as opposed to just knowing and being with the monk. So they bury both bodies. They find that the monk was on his way to the king to give word that the sheriff has captured Robin Hood. They go down to London, pretending that they're the monk and his assistant, and the king's elated at this because that means one of his central highways is now safe. He ends up giving Much the Miller's son and Little John like £50 as a reward for turning in Robin Hood, and they also give him a slap-up meal, a nice couple of horses to get back to Nottingham. They come back to Nottingham, and then still disguised as the monk and his assistant, and then they get taken into the sheriff's house, who the sheriff has now received word that the king is coming up in about a week's time. Brilliant, says the sheriff. This is great. This means I can get a promotion. This is fantastic. And they get really, really drunk. At which point, Little John, Much the Miller's son, It's most of Millicent ends up going back to the Greenwood. It's always referred to as the Greenwood, and it's never actually explicitly called Sherwood, but we know it's Sherwood. Even though there are other tales where it argues that it's a place called Barnesdale, which can either be in Rutland, because there's a Barnesdale there, or it could be Barnesdale near Doncaster. And this is where the whole argument between Yorkshire and Nottinghamshire being a place of Robin Hood. You see, this is what I mean. This is why I made the podcast the way it is. Tell the story, then the facts. Shush, Dylan. So Little John finds the jail that Robin Hood's in, and he ends up killing the jailer by taking off his head. Lots of head chopping in this. It's like something out of Highlander. And then they use the keys to get Robin out, give Robin the sword. They fight their way out, and then they end up legging it down from the castle walls, down into Nottingham, and off into the Greenwood, whichever direction is from there. The sheriff wakes up the next day with a complete hangover. His guards are running pell-mell. They're telling him that Robin Hood's escaped. And then the sheriff realizes, oh, no. Then the king's coming up next week, and it's going to take us a week to get this all sorted. Robin gets back to the Greenwood, where he asks for forgiveness from Little John. He realizes he's being a bit of an idiot. He's been a bit of a sore loser, and he says sorry. And Little John forgives him and says, look, all I want is for you to be our captain, and that's good enough for me. And they make friends again. And that is the very, very first story of Robin Hood. So we haven't got this gallant gentleman with a twirling moustache. We haven't got any robbing from the rich and giving to the poor. And we haven't got any love story with Maid Marian, except for some weird obsession with the Virgin Mary. So, yeah, it's a very interesting character and how he's evolved. A bit like what we were saying before about how folklore evolves from actual events into something different. And so it is with Robin Hood. So for every generation who's told these ballads, who's told these stories, made these movies, the TV series, whatever, he's something to everybody. And he's also something to everyone. I've just repeated myself there. Sorry about that. But he, depending on what you want Robin Hood to be, what you will get out of it, I think.
Yeah. It's just very thing. You have like TV shows, you have like movies, Maid Marian, you have this, you have that. You said he was a Saxon, he was fighting the Normans. You have so many stories of it. Yeah.
No, you really do. You really do. I mean, Tony, one of the Robin Hoods I was on about, he's very vehemently against Robin Hood being a Saxon. He's even argued about this to people, saying, look, he wasn't a Saxon, he was an Englishman, because by that point we were all called the English. And he's right, historically we were. So this whole idea of Robin being a Saxon freeman under the occupation of the Norman overlords, it's like, yeah, but that's 200 years since 1066, mate. We're all English here at this point. And yes, our nobility did carry on speaking French, and they did carry on speaking Latin amongst the learned classes. But at this point, we didn't call ourselves Normans and Saxons then. I mean, we probably called each other a lot worse, a bit like we do today. It is that thing where, depending on what story or what version you want to tell of Robin, is depending on what angle you're going to go down. So one of my arguments against Robin being this pagan character, it's very easy to associate him with a Jack in the Green sort of character. Yeah, okay, he lives in the woods, he wears green for camouflage or whatever. That doesn't necessarily mean he's being nice about it, especially when he's performing highway robbery at the end of the day and lopping off the heads of holy men. But the TV series, Robin of Sherwood, brilliant series. I remember growing up with it and watching it, and when I was a kid, I watched it. I think last time I watched it was back in 2010 when I borrowed a DVD set off a friend of mine. And that was the very first instance where you got this idea of a pagan Robin Hood, this whole idea of Herne the Hunter and being blessed with all these magical items, the sword Albion and all that. And it's like, well, that's where it comes from. This whole idea of Robin Hood. Could he possibly be a character from pagan times? No, because he was Christian, and very, very outwardly spokenly so, being a Christian. So, but why was he attacking the churches? Because he saw them as corrupt. He didn't see them as helping the people they were supposed to help. He saw them as just being in business and profit for themselves, and they were. In fact, the Bishop of Hertford, he was an actual person who was speaking to, oh gosh, which king was it? Can't remember, but it was it was actually the bishop's idea to raise the taxes so the church could get more revenue, and this is what started getting people angry about. So this whole thing about, well, Robin Hood's Christian, he's targeting the church. He's targeting the church as a money-making mechanism.
Okay, thank you for that, Dylan. Back to you, Lee.
And at this point, we'll take a question from Dave.
Yeah, just going back to, obviously, that's the era of the 12th, 14th century. Where do the earliest, we stick to the East Midlands, folk stories come from? And which is the most common era of these stories?
Oh, that's a very good question. I would say perhaps the earliest ones come from the 800s or 900s, which is Ethelreda, who was the Saxon princess who helped defend Leicestershire. She was all about getting married, I think, to another king, but that particular suitor was killed by the Norse. And once she found out that the Norse were coming to sack Leicester, she devised tactical plans to basically, I think it was her that poured hot oil over the battlements of the actual defensive wall of Leicestershire against the borough around there, which helped fight them off, and they all ran. That was it. She ended up she set up a whole volley of archers across the walls, because they still had the Roman walls back then, and they fortified them. So they shot against the Norse, who charged forward, and the ones that reached the walls, they poured hot boiling oil onto them, and they actually did it in a way. She actually did it in a way where the only place they could run to was this marshland. So these Norse warriors were trying to sack Leicester, ended up getting boiled, burned alive, shot at, and decided, oh bloody hell, these guys are well armed than we thought. Leg it, I don't care, over there. And because where the fires were set, the smoke was billowing into their eyes. They were charging out into the marshlands, and were getting bitten to buggery by all the flies and whatever else, and decided, you know what, Leicestershire's not worth it. Let's just go somewhere else. So I would say that whether that story actually came from them, I don't know. The actual events themselves, I believe, did happen. But Ethelreda was celebrated and praised for it. Maybe later. But I would say, if I was to give a date, then you're probably looking around 900. When the Vikings were very much coming into Britain at that time. But in terms of the general East Midlands story, and when are they kind of set, that's the thing. I would say they were all because they all kind of follow a certain trope or themes that can be used for any time period, and that's the problem, because you could set them anywhere. I would say if you were to set one in a modern day, you can, but you're probably looking at something more like up to the 1940s in terms of believability. So you could actually have a story where this young boy gets lured into a fairy trap. You could have that set in the 1940s. You could set that nowadays, but with maybe interference with mobile phones or something. But if you're asking for like a general time period of when these stories are told, you're looking at anywhere between 1500s to 1500s up to the 1700s primarily, and then you've got a whole bunch of stories which are from the 1700s up to 1900, somewhere around there. That's where the main medium of stories tends to be set.
Thank you.
I hope that answered your question.
Yeah.
Well, would you believe we have run out of time?
No.
I know that's gone so quickly, hasn't it? That hour.
Yes.
However, Dylan, would you be happy to join us again for a part 2?
Absolutely. If you guys are okay to have me to do that.
Yeah. Nah.
Definitely, yes, because there's a lot more that we need to discuss, and it would be nice to hear another couple of your tales.
Cool. Okay, yeah, that'll be fine. I'm happy to do that for you.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Dylan. And this is me saying goodbye for the time being. So it's goodbye, Dylan. And goodbye, Chris.
Bye.
And goodbye, Dave.
Goodbye.
And goodbye from Dylan.
We'll catch you next time on the Shadowcast.